Committee will come to order. This week, Senate Republicans filibustered a continuing resolution that would have raised the debt ceiling. They also blocked giving Democrats the ability to do what Republicans have called for, which is raising the debt with only Democratic votes. Apparently, they're unwilling to even take yes for an answer. I'm disappointed to see that some members are playing games with the full faith and credit of the United States. We must get this done, and we have to act fast. This isn't about whether you support the president's agenda. This is about paying the bills that we have already racked up, including under the prior Republican president and Republican Congress. Now, many of my colleagues on the other side have acted as though reconciliation is some kind of panacea that will allow us to easily raise the debt ceiling along party lines. Well, let me remind them that there are challenges with that, and it will take time that we do not have. Just yesterday, the Treasury Secretary said that we are likely to hit the debt limit on October 18th, just days from now. So if we want to avoid default quickly, we need to come together and get this done, just as our nation always has. Look, Congress can be a little dysfunctional sometimes, but we've never defaulted in our 200-plus year history. As I said here last week, I voted to raise the debt ceiling under Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, when I was in the majority and in the minority, because America pays its bills. We always have, and we always should. There is no ace up our sleeve here. The only way to prevent a default quickly is to pass a clean and simple bill to lift the debt ceiling, and that's what we should be considering. I've heard the comments by the Senate Minority Leader and many Republican members, but cooler heads need to prevail here. I hope they take this second chance to do the right thing for our economy and the American people and prevent a totally avoidable economic meltdown. Let me now turn to the ranking member for any comments he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our hearing today covers one item on very short notice. The bill before us today would suspend the debt ceiling through the end of 2022. Just last week, House Democrats passed a continuing resolution that included a suspension of the debt ceiling. As expected, that bill is stalled in the Senate precisely because it includes the suspension of the debt ceiling. Having hit their heads against a brick wall once, the majority now is seeking to once again slam their collective heads into that same wall. Mr. Chairman, I don't know how Republicans can be more clear on this topic. So long as this majority insists on spending money like drunken sailors on shore leave, probably unfair to drunken sailors on shore leave, Republicans will not help them to lift the debt ceiling. This year alone, the majority's already rammed through a partisan $1.9 trillion spending bill, supposedly about COVID relief, but really about a long list of partisan progressive policies. And this week, the majority is seeking to shove through another massive spending bill, which looks poised to clock in above $3.5 trillion, and which, if passed, would be the single most expensive piece of legislation in history. All of that comes on top of normal federal spending, which will cause our already huge deficit to spiral even more out of control. All this spending is the majority's prerogative. They control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. If they want to spend taxpayer dollars on big government socialist boondoggles, they can certainly do so. But they also shouldn't be surprised when Republicans decline to join them in their spending spree. After all, the majority has the power to lift the debt ceiling on their own. And if they want to keep spending money in this way, they and they alone must act. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And let me just say, I think it's clear that we will have to act alone. The question is, I think what has many of us puzzled is that why won't the Senate Republicans allow there to be a clean up or down vote? I mean, Democrats will carry it. We don't expect any Republicans to vote for it, which is unfortunate. I remember the days when Kevin McCarthy said, and I got a tweet here from like 2015, when the United States makes promises, it keeps them, which is why the House voted today to avoid the threat of debt default. But I guess he's changed his mind. That's fine. I don't understand it, other than maybe he just doesn't like the current president. But again, 97% of the debt we're talking about here was accumulated not under Joe Biden, but under his predecessor. And that's just a fact. I didn't like the tax cut bill that Republicans shoved through this Congress. I thought it was a giveaway to wealthy individuals and big corporations. It racked up an enormous amount of debt. I still voted to raise the debt ceiling because, as much as I hated those policies, as much as I thought they hurt my constituents, nonetheless, I didn't prevail. And we had an obligation to make sure that that those bills that were accumulated under the prior president were paid for. The idea of not paying for bills just because we didn't like his policies, I think is the wrong way to go. But in any event, we're happy to carry this alone. But the idea is these procedural motions to try to make it impossible don't seem to make a lot of sense to me. But I am happy to welcome our witnesses here today, the Representative Beyer and Representative Rice. We are delighted that you are here. And I'm happy now to recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Representative Beyer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I really appreciate being here and addressing this right now. Defaulting on our federal debt would create a financial crisis at least on a par with that of 2008. So catastrophic economic damage, millions of jobs lost, businesses shuttered, and a banking system in chaos. I hear my Republican friends in the Ways and Means all the time talk about how much they're concerned about small business. This would be a disaster for small business in America. Mark Zandi, who's the nonpartisan economist at Moody's, predicts that if this default happens, there will be a loss of 6 million jobs, an unemployment rate of 9%, elimination of $15 trillion in household wealth, and a decline in real GDP of 4%. Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan Chase's COO, said that such a default, quote, would cause an immediate, literally cascading catastrophe of unbelievable proportions and damage to America for 100 years. Default would likely prompt a lasting downgrade of the country's credit, which drastically increases costs for car loans, for mortgages, for loans to small business, student loans, credit card bills. It would affect every American. And the debt limit, doesn't incur new debts. It just allows payment for existing debts. Mr. Chairman, as you said, 97% of these debts were necessitated by spending in the prior administration. I haven't checked, but I think the ranking member rules voted for most of those things. The CARES Act, the big act at the end of the year. And he was right to vote for it because we had to bail out the American people, but now we have to pay for it. Yesterday, Secretary Yellen announced that by October 18th, we're going to exhaust all the extraordinary measures and the cash on hand leading us towards default. It's no accident that NASDAQ fell 2.8% yesterday, the biggest drop since March. The whole markets are worried like crazy. In just 3 weeks, the Treasury Department will be unable to pay a substantial portion of its bills in full and on time. That means nearly 50 million seniors will stop receiving their Social Security checks for a time. Troops, whom we all want to support, will go unpaid. Millions of families who rely on the monthly child tax credit will see delays. And the current economic recovery would reverse into recession, the last thing any of us want, with billions of dollars of growth and millions of jobs lost. This is a clean suspension. It doesn't actually lift the debt ceiling. It just suspends it for a little more than a year till the end of 2022. And it helps us avoid a default that's going to cost billions of dollars. This whole notion that Republicans can't vote for it because we're working to fulfill the president's agenda is empty and silly. First of all, these are their debts, not ours, that we are trying to pay for. They run the tab up and then walk away. And the Build Back Better bill is fully paid for. On our Ways and Means, we raised, we don't know what the final number will be, but we put out there enough money to pay for every single penny. So the deficit doesn't rise. There's no additional inflationary pressure. Probably the most important part, though, is it seems to me, I'm trying to choose the word carefully so that I'm not overstating, but unreasonable if you look at the debt limit has been raised 78 times since 1960, 78 times, 29 times with a Democrat in the White House and 49 times under a Republican president. So at least 49 times with a Republican president, we Democrats have come together to help you lift that debt ceiling so that they could pay the bills. And now the shoe's on the other foot for a little while and you're resisting. You know, there are long-term consequences to not working together on something that's so important as maintaining the economic growth in this country. And it's extraordinarily disappointing that our Republican friends are in the position they're in now. And I hope that we charge forward and pass this rule today and hopefully pass the legislation later this afternoon. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rice, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Happy to be here with you today. My question, first of all, about this bill is why now? I mean, this has not been a surprise that this is coming up. We've known about this since Mr. Biden's been president. He's been president now for, I guess if you take January out, about 7 months. And why do we wait till the last minute to even bring this up? And it's always been within the control of the Democrats to bring it up and to pass it. We already passed one reconciliation bill in March, could very easily have been included in that. Your decision not to include it in that and to pass it with solely Democratic votes is a mystery to me, other than you want to play a political game. And that game is a dangerous game. It's a dangerous game for our credit, the credit of the United States. It's a dangerous game for our retirees, our seniors, and our soldiers. And if those people are hurt by this, if the economy is hurt by this, then that's your choice. I mean, you are the ones who haven't made this a priority, and it's come to fruition. You make this an urgent thing because you don't raise it until just a week or two before before the debt ceiling is hit, and then you say, oh, well, now it's an emergency, and Republicans have to come together to help us solve this. And that's just a political game. You could have done this at any time before, and you can do it now. You can attach it to a reconciliation package, and you can pass it without a single Republican vote. And, you know, I think the Republicans are entirely justified in questioning this entire process and why the debt ceiling should be raised to the shocking extent that you want to raise it. I mean, when you look at the bill that you passed in March, which was the coronavirus was waning, the economy was heating back up, there were more jobs than there were people to take them, and you decided that you wanted to pass an unnecessary expansion of the entitlement state, and the result was predictable. Inflation and a slowed growth, a slowed economic recovery, and people getting paid not to work. I don't understand the Democrats' desire to have people rely on the government rather than working and making their own future, because if people rely on the government to take care of them, they will always, always live in poverty. And if you look at the cost of that $1.9 trillion American, quote unquote, American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion amounts to $5,500 for every man, woman, and child in the country. $5,500 for every man, woman, and child. Now, the way it was sold was, hey, we'll give you a $1,400 check, but don't look at what we're doing with the other $4,100 per man, woman, and child. And guess who's going to pay that back? It's not the adults today. It's their children that are going to pay it back. And they're going to pay it back even if they don't write a check. They're going to pay it back in the form of a government that's less able to respond to future crises and less able to provide opportunity for them and their children and their grandchildren. Now we come this week with a $1.2 trillion infrastructure. That's another $3,600 for every man, woman, and child in this country. And then in the coming weeks, we're talking about a $3.5 trillion, some say $4.5 trillion package, and the cost for that is $13,000. $13,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country. If you add all these up, we're adding over 30% to the accumulated debt of this country since its creation in the first 7 months of the Biden presidency. Gosh, I can't wait to see what's going to happen next year. 30%. We're talking, what, $8 trillion, $7 or $8 trillion in additional debt that we're piling on, in addition to our regular budget deficit that continues to pile on every single day. So Republicans are entirely justified in questioning the raising of this debt ceiling. You know, my belief is, some people say we should just do away with the debt ceiling as a process anyway, that too many political games are being played with it, and clearly the Democrats are playing political games today. They hold the House, they hold the Senate, they hold the presidency. They could pass this in reconciliation, and Republicans could not do anything to stop it, and yet they choose to wait till the last minute, create this emergency, and somehow magically blame Republicans that this is a problem. They could pass it tomorrow through reconciliation if they chose to do it. And Republicans are not going to participate with this exploding debt that is going to stifle our economy once again, just like they did after the financial crisis in 2008. Following the financial crisis, we came through with massive government entitled programs, massive tax increases, and the result was a stagnant economy for 8 years. And at the end of President Obama's second term, 75 or 67% of Americans believed that their children would not have the same future that they did. We responded with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that Mr. Chairman was just decrying. The result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in making America competitive, trade competitiveness, regulatory competitiveness, was, you know, I don't understand why Mr. McGovern is upset about it, because we had record lows in unemployment across every demographic. African Americans, Hispanics, women. We had wage growth we hadn't seen in 30 years, sustained 3% wage growth. You know, you talk about income inequality. We were doing something about income inequality. And then we had record low poverty. I represent one of the poorest counties in South Carolina, Marion County. It is the poorest county in South Carolina, 57% African American. When I took office in 2013, under President Obama, the unemployment rate in Marion County, South Carolina was 16.6%. 2 years after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the unemployment rate in Marion County was 3.8%. There's nothing I'm more proud of in Congress than that. I'm so proud of the result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And the reason we've had this snapback recovery as opposed to what happened after the financial crisis is because you guys hadn't had time to put in a whole lot more entitlement programs and tax increases and regulatory expansion. So I know that you're racing as quickly as you can to get all that done. And if you get it done, the predictable result will be a stagnant economy, less freedom, less opportunity, more people relying on the government. Inflation, all these things are very predictable, and they're already beginning to come true. And if you're successful in getting these additional huge spending packages across the line, you can expect to see more of the same. So, folks, I don't understand really why we're having this argument. There's no reason for it. You could pass this in reconciliation. You know you could pass it in reconciliation. You could have done it in March. You could have done it any time between now and March, and you've chosen to wait till the last 2 weeks and bring this up and say somehow it's the Republicans' fault. That is silly, and the American people will see through it.
Thank you.
And I yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter from 6 former Treasury secretaries asking Congress to act to avoid a default on the U.S. debt. Blaming this on this whole matter on timing is really curious. That's a new argument that I haven't really heard up until recently, so I guess that's fine. Let me ask either of you, I think you began to describe it, Mr. Beyer. Mr. Rice, you're more than happy to answer this as well. Can you describe what defaulting on our debt would do to our economy? You know, how disastrous would a default be?
Mr. Chairman, it would be completely disastrous. And we're looking at 9 million jobs lost. We're looking at an enormous reduction in GDP, in fact, a shrinking of GDP. But even more importantly, it would downgrade our credit. And that means that all those loans out there, including the federal government, and all the ones that you and I are paying, the interest rates themselves would skyrocket. My friend, Mr. Rice, talked about inflation. Well, let's look. Everyone's predicting inflation back to 2% next year. You have a short-term thing because of chip shortages and people being out of the airlines and the hotels in the short run. This is not because there's too much money in the economy. In fact, as we've seen again and again and again, there's an enormous amount of cash because corporate profits have been extraordinarily high. One of the things my friend misses, though, is when he says, well, it's $5,500 was what the American Rescue Plan per person. That's a little less than what it was per person for the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which cycled almost all of that money to the wealthiest people in America. So we're going to compare $5,500 or whatever per bill that's going to cost the American taxpayer. Let's make sure that we differentiate between the money that's actually going to our families, as in the American Rescue Plan, or the money that's going for corporate, for tax buybacks, for share buybacks, for dividends, for unprecedented corporate profits.
Mr. Rice, do you agree that defaulting on our obligations would be bad for the country?
Absolutely. I think it would be bad for our country, and I don't understand why the Democrat majority in the House, Senate, and presidency hadn't dealt with it already, why they wait till the last 2 weeks and try to make it an emergency and then somehow blame it on the Republicans, even though they held every lever of power. And I agree that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act on paper cost about a little less, actually, than the American Rescue Plan. But look at the difference in the result.
And
the difference in the result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was record increases in, or decade highs in wage increases, which was lowering income inequality. That is a rallying cry for the Democrats. It led to record lows in unemployment, or decade lows, 50-year lows in unemployment, and record lows for women, African Americans, and Hispanics. The very people that my friends always, try to appeal to and say that they represent. And then it also led to record lows in poverty. Record lows in poverty. How can you say that is a bad result? And I promise you that it is a fact. It's going to happen. I mean, economists are saying that that if this $3.5 trillion disaster ever actually became law, that it would cost millions of American jobs. You say that, oh gosh, if we default, it'll cost 9 million jobs. I don't know if that's correct, and I don't want to default. And
with respect, this hearing is not about what we might do down the road. We haven't passed an infrastructure bill.
Well,
we have not passed a reconciliation bill. So that's the future. This is about paying. This is about the past.
I think Republicans and the majority of the American public are horrified by the debt that is proposed by these bills coming, and that makes this debt ceiling bill a real issue if you're asking for Republican support. But if you want to do these massive expansions of entitlements that the American public doesn't want or need, if you want to do that, and you want to massively explode our debt, don't ask us to raise the debt ceiling to accommodate that.
But that's the future. I didn't want to do a tax cut that, quite frankly, disproportionately benefited the wealthy and big corporations.
That's why
I lost. You won that battle.
That's why we had record lows in poverty.
And then when it came time to raise the debt ceiling, I thought it was my obligation as a responsible legislator, even though I disagreed with Republican priorities, to pay the bills. I thought that was the responsible thing to do. Now, I think, maybe if I knew now what I knew then, I would have been like you said. I didn't like the policy, so I'm not gonna be there. But putting that aside, I think if anybody thinks that only the majority party is responsible for voting to maintain the full faith and credit of the United States, I find that very, very sad. But I certainly voted for debt limit extensions when I was in the minority, despite the fact that I did not share the values of the previous administration in any way, shape, or form. And you know what? And I get it. I don't expect a single Republican to do what I think is a responsible thing to do here, no matter what you think about. Again, 97% of what we're talking about is what Republicans and the Trump administration accumulated. This is not even, we're not even talking about Biden except for a small piece, but putting that aside, at the very least, I get it, we don't want Republicans to have to do anything here.
So when the
Can we,
Obama-
if I can ask the question, can we agree, at the very least, can we agree that members of the Republican Party should not actively try to cause a default? And by that I mean, would you agree that, yeah, have Democrats carry this, but, you know, to not, to urge your colleagues in the Senate to not use the filibuster, not use the 60-vote threshold to try to try to make it impossible to do this. Now,
You have
if you want to do reconciliation, I mean, here we are where we are, right? If you want to do reconciliation, with all due respect, you know, it's going to take a whole new process.
We are where you put us.
Yeah, well,
We are where you put us.
So in other words,
And
I think
reconciliation was available in March.
It's
been
in other
available ever
words,
since March.
you agree that Republicans should actively try to cause a default. I mean, that's the question. I mean, the deal here is
That is absolutely not the case.
you want the Democrats to carry it.
have a
Democrats will
clear
carry it.
path if
Democrats
they
will
want
carry it.
to.
We'll vote for it. I'll vote for it. I think every Democratic senator will vote for it. I mean, we have the votes. But there are procedural mechanisms, as the gentleman knows, that
make it more difficult because you waited until the 2 weeks before the
So you're
default to
you're
bring it
perfectly
up.
fine. You're perfectly fine.
Accommodating your political strategy here. No, I'm not.
Yeah, I guess what's frustrating about listening to you, Mr. Rice, here today, and then I'll yield to my colleague. It seems like you're more interested in punishing Democrats than in preserving our credit, and I think that is something that I'm having a real tough time getting my head around, because
I don't want to punish Democrats. I'm flummoxed by why you waited so long to bring this up. I don't know why you wanted to create this emergency.
Yeah.
Because it's entirely of your creation.
Yeah, all right, I whatever. I mean, we can. Yeah, Mr. Byer, do you want to add anything before I yield? Because
Yeah, I do. I'm just trying to think of the 78 times the debt, the ceiling was raised to prevent default. And to the best of my knowledge, not one of them was done under reconciliation, because Republicans and Democrats worked together to raise it. This is the first time. And on the wage growth now is as fast as it was after the TCJA. But even more importantly, poverty fell the greatest this summer in the course of history, including living half of our children out of poverty. You know, poverty is at a record low right now. And my friend from South Carolina keeps talking about the additional debt. No, he was with us in the 40 hours of waste and mean markup when we passed all the revenue measures to pay for 100% of this reconciliation bill. So, but by the way, it'd also be interesting to go back and look at the 78 times, how many times it was done at the end of the process. Because the nature of Congress is to do it when it's actually necessary, not 6 months or a year ahead of time.
In 2010,
Yield.
Democrats increased the debt limit by party line votes, with Democrats in control of the White House and both chambers of Congress. In 1993, Democrats on a party line vote used a reconciliation process, which included job killing, tax hikes, and an increase in the public debt limit. It's been done before. It'll be done again. You could have done it 6 months ago. I don't know why you hadn't done it till now.
I guess mistakenly, I guess, I should say that. I think it's still the responsible thing to do. I voted to raise the debt ceiling when Republicans were in charge and when Donald Trump was president. So, I mean, whatever. But like I said, you know, that we, and again, I understand. I mean, you want this to be a party line vote? We could live with it, right? I'm just simply saying that when procedural measures are being invoked on the other side to deliberately put a roadblock in place to get to a point where we could pass this with a majority, I think that's not about having Democrats carry it. That's about actively cheering on a default, which I think would be disastrous for this economy. And I'm happy to yield to Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just point out that when the debt ceiling was sent over to the United States Senate, it wasn't sent by itself. it was attached to a lot of other things to try and force Republicans to vote for the debt ceiling. So let's not, kid ourselves that the choices have not been political on both sides to some degree. Mr. Rice, I want to discuss a point that my colleagues on the other side have really made throughout the discussion. The Speaker said, and our dear colleague on Sunday night, that, quote, the debt limit's a shared responsibility, and I urge Congress to come together in that spirit on a bipartisan basis, as it has in the past, to protect the full faith and credit of the United States, unquote. Let's look at the record. The last 5 times that Congress voted on raising the debt ceiling when Republicans controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House, Majority Leader Schumer only voted for it once. President Biden never voted for it at all. Vice President Harris voted for it once. And the House Democratic leadership, with all due respect to my friend the chairman, also voted for it only a single time. So Democrats have picked and chosen when they wanted to participate in raising the debt ceiling, and they certainly didn't help us when all the power was in our hands, just as now all the power is in their hands. So, Mr. Rice, given that record, don't you think it's a little disingenuous for Democrats to continue to say that Republicans need to come to the table and vote for a debt ceiling increase when Democrat leadership did no such thing when this House was under Republican control, and when we are, as you pointed out in your remarks, greasing the skids for an explosion of spending in both an unpaid for infrastructure bill, or partially paid for, I should say, and a partially, at very best, reconciliation bill that we both know is going to explode debt, raise taxes, slow down the economy, as you pointed out very eloquently in your opening statement.
I completely agree with you, my friend, and also, as you eloquently pointed out, the debt ceiling has often been attached to bills to try to get support on both sides of the aisle, by both sides of the aisle. And I don't recall in my 8 years in Congress a time when the debt ceiling limit was, an increase was proposed in the face of this shocking level of increased spending, this shocking expansion of government, this shocking expansion of entitlement programs in an attempt to make Americans reliant on the government, these entitlement programs that the American people don't want or need. Our Constitution, our form of government is based on individual responsibility. We need a social safety net for people who are absolutely in need. But to spend, when you look at these 3 combined programs, the American Rescue Program, this infrastructure package, and the $3.5 trillion massive expansion of entitlements and taxes, $22,000 per American, man, woman, and child. 22,000, and folks, if you think that the government is going to take your 22,000 and either get it in taxes or borrow it in your name and your wife's name and your husband's name or your children's and each of your children's names, and they're going to efficiently use that money to provide these entitlements to you, and that you're going to be better off as a result, you're sadly confused. The American people don't want it. They don't need it. If there are areas we can tweak the social safety net to make it more effective, I am all ears. But I believe the debt ceiling is an effective tool for folks in Congress to be deliberate. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to deliberate. And when we reach the debt limit, that should be a time for reflection, for us to sit down and look and say, are we headed in the right direction? Is this where we're supposed to be? Is borrowing more money going to be worthwhile for the American people? And I think that we are staring down the barrel with this startling amount of additional entitlement programs and borrowing and tax increases. And I think the American people, if they understood that we're talking about $22,000 for every man, woman, and child, they would be horrified. and the Democrats want to rip the brakes out of the car and go barreling down the hill, and Republicans justifiably, it's inarguable, it's justifiable that we deliberate these things. We haven't had a single hearing, not a real hearing in any committee that I'm aware of on any of these. We're just, throw these packages together through leadership and ram them through. We're abdicating our duty. We're committing malpractice, legislative malpractice, in my opinion, by barreling down this hill, throwing all these things forward without any real foundation and borrowing $22,000 for every man, woman, and child. It's a shocking thing, and Republicans are absolutely correct to refuse to participate in this debt ceiling increase. And if the Democrats want to do it, they have a majority, they have all the levers, they can bring it up now. They could have brought it up 3 months ago. They could have passed it in March with their other reconciliation package. Why they want to create this process, I don't understand. I guess they see some political benefit in creating this emergency, but it is entirely created by them, and they can solve it themselves. And there's no reason for a government shutdown. There's no reason for a government default. But if it did happen, it was because they decided, folks, that you're not their priority. I yield back.
Well, I've voted to increase the debt ceiling under both Republican and Democratic presidents in the past. But we've always had some plan or some measure coupled with that would lower the trajectory of the debt or change something. We don't have anything like that on this occasion. There's no effort. It's like reaching your credit card limit and just keeping going, and not changing your spending habits, not thinking maybe I need to do things different. Our debt as a percentage of GDP has continued to rise precipitously from 105% of GDP in 2019 to more than 125% of GDP this year. Are you concerned about raising the debt ceiling without any attempt to control spending? Can you talk about some of the effects on the economy of those countries with excessively high debt to GDP ratios, and have we begun to see these effects in the United States?
Oh, absolutely. There have been studies that show that once you reach 90% of GDP, that the growth of the country, the economy, suffers dramatically, and it shaves points off of additional GDP growth. And we have reached that point. We're, I think, now staring at, I believe it's 125% of debt to GDP. So that is a shocking number, and we should be, in every spending bill that we do, we should be looking for ways to curb rather than grow government spending. Washington is addicted on spending, and we have got to take measures to curb it in every aspect of government, rather than these massive growths in entitlement programs and taxes and regulatory policies that these three bills that the Democrats are pushing across the line with no Republican support are doing. And the result of those things, in addition to this massive debt that they're creating, will slow our economy. It's a fact. It happened right after the financial crisis. They responded with massive entitlement programs like Obamacare, massive regulatory growth like Dodd-Frank, and massive tax increases. And the result was a stagnant economy for 8 years that only came out and recovered after the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, trade reset, regulatory reset, and the result was prosperity that was felt by every demographic in American society. And I'm very proud of it, and we need to keep it going. But they don't learn. I mean, they are addicted to big government, they're addicted to spending, they're addicted to big taxes, and they're going to make the same mistake that they made 10 years ago, and the result is going to be exactly the same. They will stagnate the economy if they get these bills across the line.
Thank you very much. Yield back now, Chair.
Thank you. The ranking member yields. I will recognize myself for brief comments. First of all, I want to thank both of our presenters, Mr. Baer, Mr. Rice, for being with us today. Just yesterday, we heard the news that we have less than 3 weeks to increase the debt limit before an economic catastrophe hits our nation. Now, I've gone to some pretty rough financial times in my life. Losing my home to a devastating fire, where I lost everything that I own, having to check into a hotel with nothing but the clothes that I had on. One of my sons was barefoot, and the other one did not have a shirt on. They escaped. We've all escaped with what we had. Very, very difficult time. But I never once defaulted on my debt. Not once. I paid my bills because that was the right thing to do. Then I was elected to the state legislature. And the previous legislatures had spent, a lot of money. And maxed out our credit cards, for lack of a better word. And there we were, facing a shutdown. And unsurprisingly, but surprisingly for me at that time, my Republican colleagues refused to pass a budget that would allow us to borrow. So the California government was shut down for 6 months. There again, I was barely into my home that I had just lost to a fire. I had not even recovered from that financial crisis. But there I was again, facing no paycheck for 6 months. Did not get paid. I had to do what I had to do to continue to pay my bills, which meant that I had to take a loan from my credit union every month to pay my Bank of America mortgage. That's what I had to do. Luckily for me, I had good credit, good enough that my credit union would give me that money. And when we finally, the voters in California, decided to give us the power to vote to approve a budget by a simple majority, 50+1, and decided to remove many of the Republican obstacles, we were able to pass a budget, to balance a budget. We had to make some really, really tough choices and reduce spending. Absolutely, we did. We did that. But I was able to pay back also immediately 6 months of debt that I had incurred while doing my job, while I was not getting paid. So, lucky for us in California, we went from a $15 billion deficit. And when I left the legislature as a state senator to come to Congress, we left a $2 billion surplus. Because we reined in spending, and we actually invested in the working poor to ensure that we gave them an opportunity to raise themselves, raise their children. So here we are. We need to give the Treasury Department the authority to pay our bills. We don't get to walk away from our responsibility. The federal government can't file bankruptcy. And unfortunately, the bankruptcy laws were changed also in 2005. Even if we were to compare the federal government to an individual, 2005, Republicans said, updated the bankruptcy laws because they did not feel that people should go out and what they felt that people were going out and charging their credit cards purposely, spending all this money so then they can later go on and file bankruptcy. And 2 members that are sitting right here voted for that. So it was not good enough for your constituents to file bankruptcy when they get into financial trouble because they lost their job, because they did not have insurance, because this was before the Affordable Care Act, and they had massive medical bills. No, you denied them the opportunity to file bankruptcy Because how dare them not pay their rent? Well, how dare us not pay our bills? Your bills. Remember the tax scam where we thought it was good enough to give the 1% a tax break because they deserved it? Well, here we are. If they deserve to get a tax break, then every government employee, veteran, and every soldier that is out there fighting for our freedoms at home and abroad deserves to continue to get paid. This is not a choice. I didn't like the tax scam. I did not vote on that bill. This is not a choice that we have before us to go back and debate legislation of the past. The choice that we have in front of us is to be responsible members of Congress, duly elected members of Congress, responsible people to vote, to pay our bills, to give authority to the Treasury to pay our bills. That's what this is all about. It's not about what we're going to do in the future. It's not about what has already been done in the past. Many of our colleagues that will be voting on this today or tomorrow or whenever we bring it up, we're not even here to support those measures. You know, it is really unfortunate that we forget how a government shutdown will play out. Not in our politics. It's not about us. It's not about our reelection. It is about consumers. And the losers in this, when we lose our credit rating, is if you're a brand new homeowner, if you are someone who is trying to buy a home right now, and we shut down the federal government, and the interest rate is increased as a result, that's not on the backs of the responsible people that pay their bills. That's on the backs of the people that refuse to pay their bills. We don't walk away from our responsibility. We face it head on. I know that we can do this because we did it in California. And everybody, when our government was shut down, everybody laughed and pointed and said, there's the 5th largest global economy, and people that hate us because they ain't us, piled on that shame. It's regained its, economy, its value, its credit rating. It's a great state. I will urge my colleagues to support this, whether you like the tax scam that was passed or not. It's not about the tax scam. It's not about previous expense. It is about paying our bills. It's our responsibility. And with that, I'm going to yield to Mr. Burgess for his comments.
Thank you. Mr. Rice didn't intend to relitigate the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, but it does seem like it's been the object of some discussion. You, of course, were on the all-powerful Ways and Means Committee that wrote that legislation. If I recall correctly, the scoring of that legislation was dependent upon the economy only growing at some low rate, which in fact wasn't reality, and had the pandemic not intervened, you were very likely to be in excess, which has been reflected in the remittances to the government in the tax code. So would you care to revisit that just a little bit and help us remember why the bill was scored the way it was and what likely would have occurred had the pandemic not intervened?
Excuse me, Mr. Burgess, you're exactly correct that I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was in the low 2% assumption on GDP growth And our belief was that if we passed the law, that in addition to the benefits that played out in terms of the lowest poverty ever, the lowest unemployment for a lot of groups that had suffered from income inequality in the past, that the fastest wage growth and so forth, that the economy would grow more quickly, and that did play out. And I think it only had to go up by about 0.5% over the projections, and the bill would have paid for itself. Had coronavirus not intervened, I believe it would have paid for itself. But that's crystal ball. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this, because since we all have such short memories, do you recall a phenomenon of what used to be called corporate inversions?
Yes, sir.
Can you remind us what a corporate inversion was?
Well, that's because companies couldn't afford to operate here and compete with companies that were operating in other places that paid lower taxes. So I would routinely, when we had hearings on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which we hadn't had any hearings on any of these massive spending programs that the Democrats have proposed here, no hearings. But when we would have hearings on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and have economists in front of us, I'd ask them, if you have a company that operates in America paying 35% and another company that operates in Ireland paying 13%, and they make exactly the same product, they compete for the same materials, and they compete for the same customers worldwide, can you tell me the result of that? And the answer was uniformly that the American company would either go bankrupt or get bought by the Irish company. And, there were 4,700, I believe is the correct number, inversions in the 10 years prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and there have been 0 since then, 0. And what is fascinating to me about this whole process, and a reason why this debt ceiling debate is very, very good, because we can reflect on these things and we can point out where we've come from and where we're headed. But coming out of the financial crisis, we should have had a very sharp snapback. But we didn't. Why didn't we? Because we grew taxes, we threw regulations that smothered the economy, and we had massive entitlement program expansion. And we smothered the economy for 8 years, and the American public was frustrated. When Republicans took control and we lowered regulation, cut taxes, trade policy, and so forth, the result was entirely predictable. Now, and people prospered. And had we not had the coronavirus, it would have continued. And our recovery coming out of the coronavirus has been very, very sharply up. The reason is because we haven't had this massive expansion of entitlements, massive tax increases, massive regulatory expansion yet.
Until now.
Yet. And when they do it, we don't learn, right? Because we did it right after the financial crisis. We stifled the economy for 10 years. We undid it, the economy recovered. Now we're just hell-bent for glory. We want to go back and raise taxes again, raise regulations again, and let's go ahead and create these entitlement programs that the American people don't want or need yet. But now when they stifle the economy, we probably will need some of these entitlement programs, because they're going to take the jobs away from the very people that they're saying they're trying to help.
Well, that's why I made the point about corporate inversions, because we've all seen them close to either in our districts or close to our districts. I remember a company that made oriented strand board in East Texas, and they closed, and I don't remember how many thousand employees are suddenly on the streets looking for work. And that's a stark figure to go from, what did you say, 4,700 to 0. I hope people remember that affects real folks who are our neighbors and our constituents when their job goes overseas, because now our companies cannot compete with the tax rates of other companies that, oh, by the way, are probably heavily subsidized by their governments as well. So, we can say a lot of things about capital. I believe in investment in capital, but you and I know capital is not courageous. And if you beat it up too bad, it'll go somewhere else. It's not proud of. You don't like me here, I'll go over there. But I do want people to remember that the corporate inversion, which was so damaging in our country, went away because of the work, the value of the work in your committee and we should be grateful for
My
that.
friend, I represent a primarily rural district in South Carolina. I have the part of the coast. I have Myrtle Beach and Georgetown counties and a lot of tourism there, but you go 5 miles inland, it's very rural and very poor. And Marion County, 57% African-American, poorest county in the state. Dillon and Marlboro, three of the 10 poorest in the state, majority African-American. And they were textiles and tobacco. Textiles and tobacco and until the 80s. And the last time we did tax reform, we were competitive in 1986, and then we sat on our hands and watched the world pass us by and didn't do anything about it. And it's predictable what happened with the inversions and all that type of thing. Well, as I said, when I took office in 2013, January 2013, the unemployment rate in Marion County was 16.6%. Those people didn't have a chance. They didn't have a chance. We have entitlement programs for you, but man, you live on the government entitlement program, you're gonna live in poverty. That's just it. We come in and we pass trade reform, regulatory reform, tax reform, and within 2 years, the unemployment rate in Marion County was 3.8%. It was a combination of juice in the national economy and the Dillon Inland Port infrastructure makes the country competitive. And I couldn't believe it. It was a huge success story, and I'm more proud of that than anything I've done in Congress. And it just breaks my heart to see that these guys are just determined to make the same mistake they made 10 years ago and to stifle our economy once again.
Well, you made another point, and I just think it is so important that it needs, I mean, I realize that half of America is probably riveted on the C-SPAN channel on the Rules Committee this morning. Actually, I wish that were the case. I wish people were paying attention to what we're doing up here.
Yeah.
But you did the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, passed on a party line vote, passed on the reconciliation, I get all that, but you did have some hearings. You did some work leading up to it.
Absolutely,
It didn't just spring from the speaker's head and come to the floor of the House.
We worked for a year before we passed, or over a year before we passed that bill.
And then the other thing is, I am fortunate, I use that word in quotation marks, but I am fortunate to serve on the Committee on Energy and Commerce, one of the principal authorizing committees that's not Ways and Means. I serve on the Budget Committee for reasons I don't understand, and I serve on the Rules Committee. So I get to see this bill probably more than any other member of Congress, the reconciliation bill. And all we've had are markups. We have not had any hearings. Nobody knows what's in this thing. Nobody can tell you, but we've got to expand the debt limit till December of 2022 so we can pass this bill that hasn't even been written yet.
We're not even putting a number on the increase in the debt limit.
Well, and that was going to be my other point.
Yeah.
When you put it just at a calendar date and not a number, who knows where that needle's going to stop spinning? So this debt limit, expansion of this debt limit with no upper margin, with no chance to revisit it until December of 2022, paves the way for the spending bill that is quickly going to follow, that they say is $3.5 trillion, but I'm here to tell you, I've never marked up a bill in the Budget Committee that doesn't have a CBO score. We've marked up bills in our authorizing committee without a CBO score, because our speaker then said, we got to do this. But you didn't go to the Budget Committee with a budget reconciliation bill where you didn't have a score or an opinion from the Congressional Budget Office. This was nuts. We marked this bill up in the middle of the night, Saturday night, on a Zoom call.
It seems to me that's the opposite of responsibility. Mrs. Torres was calling for us to be responsible. This is what we're doing here with no hearings and creating this emergency that didn't need to exist for political purposes is wholly irresponsible. It is embarrassing that the Democratic majority would allow the country to come to this point.
Well, and you can identify, it's like everything else, follow the money and you see where the payoffs are. You can see where the special interests are going to get their coffers filled. But this is not the way to run the People's House. This is not the way to run the all-powerful Rules Committee, to bring a bill like this up literally on a moment's notice with the type of implications that this bill has. I think I agree with the ranking member that we should not be doing this today. If we're going to have the debt limit, then let's have an open rule. Let's let everybody talk about it on the floor, because there's a lot riding on this. Again, I hope the half of the country that is glued to their televisions today, not watching The Price is Right, but the Rules Committee, understands just the enormity of what is happening here this morning.
Folks at home, this is not George Clooney, I'm Tom Rice, okay?
It's what?
I said, I'm not George Clooney, I'm Tom Rice. I know people get confused.
Yeah, I know. Don't you hate that? I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning, again on short notice. And we always
great
enjoy
pleasure.
we always enjoy hearing from members of the Ways and Means Committee, and I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields. Before I recognize Mr. Raskin for comments, I just want to reinstate that today's debate is about raising the debt bill. It's not our debt. It is not about a transportation, an infrastructure bill. It's not about the president's bill. It's about nothing else than raising the national debt. So, there was a comment about, businesses leaving, manufacturers leaving our country. Many of people left because they left to countries that have no minimum wage, no labor standards, no wage standards, no environmental standards, no building standards, and we come to find out that in many cases there were child labor issues also. Mr. Ruskin, I will recognize you for your comments or questions, but you need to turn on your camera. Okay, I'm going to move on to Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you very much. This debate feels like exactly why people hate Congress. I mean, we have bills to pay. We have to get it done. We need the debt limit raised, and so we should do it. It's irresponsible and kind of whining to say, oh, well, it's the wrong timing. I obviously support the underlying bill, and I look forward to passage. Mr. Byer, was there anything you wanted to add at this point?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman Scanlon. I'm trying to resist all the misstatements, all the record that needs to be corrected, especially the irresponsible part. Because if you think about it, what my Republican friends are saying is that this problem needs to be fixed. I just don't want to help fix it. It's equivalent to having the house is burning down. You say, well, I don't want the house to burn down, but I'm not going to pick up a hose or do anything about it. My friend from South Carolina and I both voted in September of 17 to raise the debt limit. I'm sure most of us on this call that were here then. And we did it right before the enormous $2 trillion TCJA. So there's just bottom line is that a no vote on this bill is a vote to wreck the economy, to cause recession, and it costs millions of Americans their jobs. It's very simple. And as Ms. Torres said, this is not about the bills to come, and it's not even about the huge run-up in debt, the largest in history under Donald Trump. This is about making sure that we can pay our bills in the weeks to come.
Thank you for that, and I would yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Okay. Mr. Morelli, you're recognized.
Well, thanks so much, Madam Chair. Thanks to Mr. Byer. Thank you for being here, Mr. Price, and appreciate all the comments that have made. I'll be relatively brief. I used to love as a kid magic shows. I don't know much about them. I certainly don't know the business. I loved, sort of suspending disbelief and watching all the stuff that went on. And although I don't know much about it, I gather most of it involved, if it was really good, sort of a sleight of hand, but it involved distraction. So you'd sort of, look over here, but the thing's really over here. And I feel a little bit like I'm watching, with all due respect, sir, a little bit of the grand old party's magic show. So we'll talk about Biden and we'll talk about spending, but we all know that a relatively, de minimis amount, 3% of what we're talking about has been, as a response to things that have happened in this administration. And look, I'm not, I know we on both sides, we like to talk about what everybody else did to add to the national debt. I mean, we're all responsible, maybe not individually, maybe we weren't here, but I think collectively, we've seen over the decades what we believe are in the interest of the American public. And I think Chairman McGovern said it well. He didn't agree with the 2017 tax cut. Sure didn't vote for it, but has been prepared to make sure that we stand behind the national needs and the responsibility of the national government. So I find that, I'll admit, frustrating. I also, you talk about timing, but I'm not going to lie, and I won't ask you to answer this, the distinguished gentleman, Mr. Price, but I suspect that the timing doesn't really have anything to do with your vote. I suspect if we were doing this in March, you wouldn't be any more inclined to vote for it than you are right now. I won't ask you to answer it, but so I think raising the timing of the issue, and it is funny though that you said we could have seen months ago this was coming, but months ago Joe Biden had literally just taken office. So I think that in some ways that undercuts your argument because you're basically acknowledging that most of the work that we're doing now to raise the debt ceiling were for bills that we encumbered much longer ago. I also, I always do find it a little interesting to talk about. I mean, I know people use the word socialism a lot. We were talking about earlier, there was a conversation about sort of, creating a new federal program, and one of the leading Republicans at the time said one of the traditional methods of imposing socialism has been by way of medicine. And if the bill before the Congress passes, one of these days, you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in America when men were free. And that was Ronald Reagan talking about the Medicare program. It's sort of funny. Mr. Smith in Missouri, the ranking member of the Budget Committee, was here just a few weeks ago going on and on about how Democrats were destroying this sacred program, Medicare. So, I just find it, again, I know we're all, we all have jobs to do here, and we all have positions to take, and we all have things that we believe in. I don't dispute at all what I think are heartfelt beliefs of yours about the role of government. But I think we do raise a lot of red flags sometimes as part of that magic show to distract and to say, well, it's all this, it's all that, when it's not that. It's not about the Biden administration. It's not about the timing, frankly, because I don't think that would have changed your vote. And frankly, I also think we're prepared. You're right. This is going to be clearly is going to fall to the Democrats to be obligated to do this. I think that's unfortunate because effectively I'm going to vote in the next several days to raise the debt limit on things that President Trump did, probably some things that President Obama did. I'm okay with that because I analogize this to even, we always talk about these things in broad terms. This, to me, if I came home one day and said to my wife, I bought a fitness, thing, we're going to put in the basement, it's great, it only cost me a couple $1,000s, she'd probably look at me like I had two heads. But I suspect when the bill came due, she'd write the check because she, hey, okay, that's what we did. If she goes out and buys something I think isn't necessarily essential to the household, guess what? I'm going to pay the bill. Because that's what we do. So even in our households, we may not agree, but we certainly aren't going to go bankrupt, or we're not going to declare to our debtors, we're not paying you, because on reflection, I don't think my wife or my son or my brother or whoever it is made the right decision. Okay, that's part of what we do. So this magic show, I feel, is a little bit like you've got the campaign literature written, the TV commercials done, and so now you just have to make sure that it comes true. Or that you make sure you're not a part of doing this. And the sad thing for me, I'll say is ultimately, and I mentioned this I think the last time we talked about this here, is the fundamental need for us as a nation to do this. This again, and I think Mr. McGovern, the chairman, said this well, a lot of things that he has disagreed with in the past that didn't agree with the policy, didn't agree with, rolling up debt, but is prepared to make sure the United States government stands behind its debt and its commitments. And look, People believed back in 2017, I wasn't here, that borrowing money to give to corporate interests and others because honestly they felt at the time that was going to generate a better economy. Okay, I don't agree. I think history has shown us that didn't happen, actually. And it didn't pay for itself like it was pledged to be. And we believed that borrowing money to do that at a time when the economy was already doing very well was not necessary, and there were many economists that agreed with us. That doesn't even matter in my mind for what we're doing right here, what we're doing today, right now. And you're free, and you're clearly going to vote against reconciliation or the infrastructure. I don't know. I mean, you'll make a decision in your heart about what you think is right about the direction of the country. But what I would hope is that none of us, despite our differences about the direction, whether in the minority, the majority, is that we stand for the full faith and credit of the United States government. That's what binds us together, not as Democrats, not as Republicans, but as Americans, and as responsible American leaders who have to make the decision. So we know for sure that failure to extend the debt limit will have catastrophic consequences that are global in nature, not just going to affect your district, they're not going to affect Rochester, New York, they're going to affect the world economy. And I think you know in your heart of hearts we can't do that. We're not going to that's not going to happen. But the argument you're making, which I find frustrating, and I hate to point to you, but you're the only one here, and you've chosen to be here, so I guess that's part of the equation here. But that it just troubles me that if in the future we're going to say, well, it's a Republican in the White House, Republican majority in the House, Republican majority in the Senate, no matter what else happens, that's their obligation. But that's not how this is supposed to work. We're all here. We all take the same oath. We all have the same government to protect. We have the same country to protect. And I know in your heart you know that. And so I think this should not, must not, cannot be the precedent we set for the future, that we'll only vote to raise the debt limit or to do the other hard things when our party's in power. And when it's not, we're going to step aside that responsibility and lay it at the feet of the other party because it's the political interest. And I think this is a decision that we need to put the national interest before our political interest. And with that, I'm pleased to yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I think you wanted to
Well,
respond.
I mean, I don't want the government to default, and I've voted in the past to prevent the government from default. But this is, what we're doing here is truly unprecedented. And I think the purpose of the debt limit is to make us stop and reflect on what we're doing. And the level of spending here is unprecedented. I mean, if you look at the $7 trillion plus in these various reconciliation plans that you're talking about, if you look at the normal budget of the United States, which is over $4 trillion a year, you're talking about $11 trillion that you guys want to spend. $11 trillion. That's almost half of all our prior accumulated debt in 250 years of the existence of the country. And you think that we should say, oh, yeah, you're right, we should just extend the debt limit without time. And there hadn't been, and the shocking thing about that is there hasn't been a single hearing on any of it. None of it. You just want to ram it through and expect us to say, oh, yeah, you're right, we should just raise the debt ceiling and not question it. That's insane. No, absolutely not. I think we're doing entirely the responsible thing, and you could have handled this. You hold every lever of power, and then you turn around and blame us because you hadn't done it before now? That's crazy. Come on, the American people see through that.
Well, actually, I appreciate that. I'm not blaming you. You're going to vote no. I understand it. I think what troubles me isn't so much that, it's the precedent we're setting that we're going to say we're only going to stand behind the United States government and pay its bills when it's in our political interest, not in the national interest. And respectfully, I would say this too, that we're prepared to do pay-fors for most of this. People keep saying that the amount of money that we expect to spend, which doesn't have anything to do with the bill in front of us or raising the debt limit on our past obligations, isn't paid for. But we're desperately trying to make sure that it's paid for. So that doesn't add to the national debt. I was here in the NDAA, and we did an amendment to increase spending in the defense side by $25 billion. Someone said, hey, this might add to the debt. $25 billion, a lot to put on our children. Okay. So we will pay for it. You're going to vote. Yeah. And by the way, use your voice to argue against reconciliation. Use it to argue against infrastructure. Use it to do all the things that you're doing. But don't on this, it seems to me. Don't use this moment to make that argument, which is largely a political argument, and I think it's a legitimate one. You're free to make your political arguments, and I am too. But when it comes to full faith and credit of the United States government has catastrophic potential consequences on the national and world economy, then I think it's just a bridge too far for me. That's just my opinion.
Well, I hear you, and my response to that is, don't wait until 2 weeks before the default and create a false emergency and then expect everybody to fall in line in the face of all this massive spending with no hearings.
Well, again, sir, I don't mean to be argumentative, but I don't think the time, I mean, you can talk about the timing. I get that. I mean, that's one of your talking points. But if we had brought this up in February and said we know this debt limit's coming up and it's going to come up in September or October, we don't know exactly the timing because you never know how quickly money's going out and money's coming in. Okay. But we'll do it now because we think that's the prudent thing to do. We could have done that. Maybe we should have done that. I suspect, and I'll let you, I said before I wasn't going to put you on the spot. It wasn't going to change your vote on this. I don't think. So you want to raise it, okay, you want to say that we brought it to the precipice, which, by the way, is I suspect what the precedent has been every time the debt limit's been raised. It's probably almost always on the precipice of default. Maybe not. I'm not a historian on the debt limit being raised. But all I'm saying is, so why raise that issue when that really doesn't in any way complicate this for you? You were going to vote no anyway. Maybe for all the reason, maybe, But all I'm saying is that's part of what I feel is like a magic show going on. This is a distraction. It's a narrow issue, and I think we're bringing in, which on many things we do, but the vast majority of those things don't involve the full faith and credit of the United States government. So thank you for your time. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. By the way, that fitness equipment that costs several $1,000s that your wife has to pay for, they make good coat racks if you don't use it. So, Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you I had to step out to look into another committee quickly since schedules are tight right now. But first of all, I would like to associate myself with the remarks of Ranking Member Cole and Ranking Member Rice. I think that there's some real concerns about how we're handling this right now, and so I appreciate Mr. Rice's input on this. But I also, Mr. Burgess had mentioned the December 17th, 2022 date, and I think, Mr. Rice, then you started talking about there's no limit on the amount of money. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, explain it a little bit. This is my first debt limit debate, and so I'm kind of curious as to know if that date is typical, that we usually extend these over a year. In particular, is there any significance to that date? Or if you could talk a little bit more about that and the significance of no dollar limit in the bill.
Thank you, Mrs. Fishback. I am no scholar on the debt limit other than to say when I got here 8 years ago that the debt limit, when it was raised, it was by a specific amount of money. And that only in recent times have we put up debt limit extensions that they were based on dates and not specific amounts of money. And again, I think that is particularly horrifying in this circumstance where we're talking about these massive spending bills that, this is not a secret, and we've had markups but no hearings on these. The details are still being ironed out, and yet we're being asked here to support a debt limit increase with no amount. I think that is a completely irresponsible way to govern. My history professionally is I'm a CPA and a tax lawyer, and if I had seen one of my clients doing anything equivalent, I would have said that they were irresponsible. And to manage the United States government in a fashion where we're barreling into these massive programs that we don't know what they're going to cost. There's no official projection for a lot of the details hadn't been finished. and that we're being asked here simply to write a blank check, to hand over a blank check and say spend whatever it costs, is ludicrous. And I could never support that. I could never look my constituents in the face and support that. It is completely irresponsible.
And thank you, Mr. Rice. I guess I'm just concerned that we're extending this over a year. And particularly, I think everybody would know here that it's after the next election. And I think that it signals to me that the majority has no intention of addressing any kind of debt or doing anything like that, given the, over a year timeline they're giving themselves. But, and given that the Democrats are in control right now, and you mentioned that, do the Democrats, actually have the time to amend the reconciliation bill to allow for the increase in the debt limit and then, allow it to be considered? Because if they put it on the reconciliation, then do they have time to have it considered in the Senate?
Of course they do. They don't want to. It would rush the process, but they could have done it before now. This is an entirely created crisis. It could have been dealt with in the March bill, the American Rescue Reconciliation Plan. It could have been dealt with at any time between now and March, and they choose to wait until the last minute. Ms. Torres said earlier, well, we just heard about this 2 weeks ago. My goodness, if you're in control of every branch in the government and you didn't foresee this coming, something is terribly, terribly wrong. No, this is entirely predictable, and they chose, for whatever political reason, to make this into a crisis. And somehow, when they control every lever of power, to try to blame it on the Republicans, and the American people are not going to buy it.
And Mr. Rice, I guess the simple thing is that they do have the ability, they have the time to do it, they have the time to do it without Republicans, but they choose to do it this way and blame Republicans. So, and with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Before I yield to Mr. DeSagne, can I just say it's really refreshing to hear Republicans talk about the debt when for the previous administration nobody would even acknowledge that it was an issue. And if I remember, I was here when the tax cut was rammed through the Congress. They were not paid for. Added $2 trillion to the debt, and nobody talked about it. And yet, when it came time to raise the debt ceiling, there was a bipartisan vote to do so. So it's really, you ate the meal, but you don't want to pay the bill. I get it, but it's a little hard to hear these arguments about the debt when it didn't matter for the last 4 years. And I think, those of us who supported increasing the debt ceiling under the last administration did so not because we approved of the policies, but we felt that the bills were accumulated and we had to pay for them. And as Mr. Morelli pointed out, I have no idea what a reconciliation package will look like. I can tell you that every effort is being made to pay for it, which the tax cuts weren't paid for, but we are trying to pay for it. We'll see, but that even hasn't been approved, nor has a bipartisan infrastructure bill been approved. To the best of my knowledge, unless I missed the vote.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
if you'll
Gentleman
yield for a
from
moment.
Texas.
Right, we don't have a reconciliation bill, and yet we've marked it up in multiple committees of jurisdiction and the Committee on the Budget. And you're going to get it next, but we don't have the bill. So good luck.
Yeah, well, as the gentleman knows that, nothing becomes law until the House and the Senate pass it and the President signs it. So, but we could speculate all we want about the future, but what we're talking about are the bills that you voted to accumulate. And
If I could respond on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I know the CBO score was for, that it wasn't completely paid for, but that was based on a GDP growth rate that I thought was unrealistically low, and I believed then, and I believe now, that had we not had coronavirus, it would have paid for itself.
well, we do know that the tax cut bill added significantly to our debt. And yet, and by the way, a lot of the spending that ended the previous administration in various ways added to our debt, and and most of them, I mean, I didn't vote for, most of them, my friends here voted for. Ms. Fishback wasn't here yet, so I can't blame you for that. That's right. Right, but the bottom line is, you know, I mean, come on, I mean, whatever. All right, Mr. Desagne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know all of you want about California, but I just want to associate myself with my colleague and my former colleague in the state senate in California and the experience we had. And I do think it's analogous. All those years ago, the Constitution, as Representative Torres said, that, and this analogy to me relates to Mr. Rice's comments about the levers of power. In that instance, the state constitution at that time said that you had to have a supermajority to get our budget passed. And when the Republicans refused to give us the 5 votes in both houses, things started going very badly. Credit was the best in the country and started to drop. Courageously, 5 Republicans joined us and passed that just before when we were going off the cliff. And then, as Ms. Torres said, the voters responded by changing that supermajority. So that, I think, is analogous to the levers of power in the Congress right now. And so as long as we're talking about different policy issues, I do think there's obviously strategically and politically, I will acknowledge that, a connection. Having said that, since Mr. Morelli and I like to talk about old movies and date ourselves, when we talk about political purity in Congress, I just am reminded of the great scene in Casablanca where Claude Rains and Humphrey Bogart I'm dating myself, were walking along. Rains said, "Gambling in Casablanca? I'm shocked. Of course there's politics here. Let's be honest about it. No party has purity on that. I think the speaker has been very upfront about what her desires are. But what we have right here is what we have in front of us. And I think it's irresponsible, personally, to not vote for what's in front of us right now. We can argue about those other issues as they come in front of us. We can argue about process. I respect those arguments. But what's in front of us, given the dangers this poses to the American economy and the public, is what's in front of us. And I hope that some of our Republican colleagues join us in voting for this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to associate myself with the remarks of our colleagues and the serious concern about injecting partisanship into this process. I will say I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and we have a constitutional duty to honor the full faith and credit of the United States of America, and I will gladly vote for the rule and vote to raise the debt. I take my oath seriously, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Neguse. Okay, I don't see anybody else. Anybody else? Anybody in the audience? No, just, then I think we are done. Listen, I get it. The Republicans are not going to vote for any of this. That's fine. I think my only request is get out of the way so we can pass it and get it done. And with that, I thank our witnesses for being with us. And that, anybody else wish to testify today? On S-1301, seeing none, that closes the hearing portion on S-1301. And we are going to, without objection, the committee stands in recess subject to the call of the chair, and I think it's going to be very quick. I think it's hopefully not going to be very long. But we will. Look, if you could stay, what I'm going to say is stay for 2 minutes so I can make a phone call, and then I can let you know, all right? But you're only downstairs, so you can make it back up. You can come back up in 2 minutes.
Bring that
Okay, Rules Committee will come to order. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from California, Ms. Torres.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant S 1301, the Promoting Physical Activity for Americans Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means or their respective designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-16 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit.
You heard the motion from the gentleman from California. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole? No. Okay. So, hearing none, the question is now on the motion offered by the gentleman from California. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no.
Aye.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres?
Aye.
Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter?
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Ms. Ross?
Aye.
Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Rushenthaler? Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye. Clerk will report the total.
7 ayes, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and I'm carrying this for us. Okay, I'll see you on the floor. Okay. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.